Now we have procedural materials and texture-based materials. Procedural materials are literally step-by-step built materials. So just for demonstration purposes, let's click on procedural. And once you have everything set up, you can even choose the category of, textures you want to check for, rather materials you want to check for. And you can set your import settings. For now, I'm just going to leave everything as it is. And let's scroll up a bit. And once everything is good, we're just going to click on enter. And this is going to bring out some procedural materials we can work with. Now I'm just going to scroll a bit and let's see some materials So I'm just going to right click and we can see that this is a procedural wood for any furniture. So I'm just going to click on this and click on it and drag it to any surface that you want to add this material to and drop it. And immediately it has been mapped to the surface. And if you look over here, you can see that we have another material called furniture wood that is assigned to this. So let's look at this node setup over here. Based on our experience, we understand that the setup here helps us to map textures. So we can see that it has the scale 1 by 0.15 by 0.15. We'll fix all this shortly so we can see what is happening. And we have some special textures talking about the noise texture, Musgrave texture, and it has been mixed together with a color ramp that helps us to go from darker color to lighter colors, and everything has been connected to the base color and to the normal. And finally, we have the material output. That's awesome. So first of all, it's important to look at the UV map anytime you add a new material. That's because it can reset the UV map arrangement. And I'll click on it and just click on tab and go over to the UV editor. So in case you're not on the UV editor over here, you can set it up. Or in case this is even joined, like everywhere is open, you can open it up and switch to the UV editor. So I'm going to scroll out and you can see that the UV map is a mess right now. And what we just need to do is, first of all, ensure that everything is constrained to this grid line over here, this grid square. And that's because, like I said in the earlier chapters of this topic, I talked about the fact that moving from one software to the other, it's important to keep your UV maps arranged and constrained in the grid lines so that we can map our textures properly. So the first thing I will do is just to unwrap this. So click on A to select everything, go to U, Smart UV Project. And this time I will ensure that the island margin is at 0.001. That's because we want to ensure that there is just a little space between each island. We'll talk about that shortly. So once you set the island margin to 0.001, I think everything else is fine. I'll just click on OK, and we now have a properly set up UV map over here. Now what we have here is an arrangement of islands. Islands are simply the 2D faces of the object. And if you scroll in a little more, you can see that there is just a tiny bit space over here, and that is the 0.001 space that we kept, just to ensure that everything is, nicely arranged. So that's what we wanted to achieve. So once we're done with that, we're now good to go with working with the procedural texture. So we're now going to go further. I will tab out of edit mode, and you can see that this texture looks pretty nice, but it might not be so realistic as to, the scale of this texture. So you can decide to work on the scale over here. So I just like to try different things just to ensure that, I'm getting the best out of my textures. So it might be stretched a bit, and this is good. All right. So not to waste too much time on this, what we just need to do is understand what's really happening here. Now, we do not have any texture. That means that there is no picture that we can, say that is attributed to this particular setup here. So what is happening is we just have a bunch of node arrangements. We have some, effects, the calculations over here are done just with these nodes. So you can see that the noise texture also affects this effect, and you can see that everything contributes to the texture that you can see. So that's the idea of procedural textures. You can adjust as many things as you like on the textures. So that's the whole idea. But what we want to achieve is we want to be able to, at the end of the day, have a texture that can be mapped to the surface. To do so, I will need to bake this texture. And it's pretty simple. What you just need to do is to first of all ensure that you have a new image texture that can preserve all this information in itself. So I'm going to duplicate this node setup over here. That's the principal BSDF and the material output by clicking Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and just move it over here. Now, the way it works is the material output helps us to preview the textures or whatever setup we have. If you click on any material output, you'll be able to tell the node setup before it. So for this new material output setup, we do not have any, any other texture or anything assigned to it. So that's why it's grayed out. So to bake the texture, what we want to do is we're going to add another image. So let's just come over here, search for image texture, and just drop it over here. And the next thing is, let's create a diffuse texture, and we'll just click on new, and let's call this wood diffuse. And I love to have my textures in 4K when I want to, work with high resolution. So you can just multiply this by 4, asterisk 4. So math works here as well. So once you do so, you can click on OK. So what we just did was to rename it. We changed the resolution, and that was it. So you click on OK, and this is good to go. So again, for this to work, for baking to work, you need to ensure that you are on cycles. And we're going to go over to this render properties tab over here and ensure we're on cycles. That's good. Then for the sampling, so that we do not spend so much computational time on baking this texture. Baking is to create a texture. That's what we're essentially doing. We are creating a texture from this procedural setup. So what we want to do is we're just going to reduce this max samples. We do not need it to be as high as this. So you can take it down to even 2 is fine. Or let's not go that far. 10 is good. So we can go down to bake. So you can see here we have bake. And for this option here, we have the bake type. Once you click on this drop down, you'll be able to see the different bakes you can make or the different textures you can make. And what we want to create is a diffuse texture, also called base color, also called albedo. So we're going to click on diffuse, and we're going to ensure that we remove the light contributions. That's because if we're to bake the textures with the lights, and we moved it to, let's say, another software, it will still look as though there was a light bulb, above it. It's not going to be as realistic as we need it to be, having real-time lights and all. So we're going to remove this direct light and indirect light. We're going to uncheck it. That's for the contributions, and just leave only the color. So what we did was we ensured we were on cycles. We also reduced the render. We reduced the max samples for the render from 4K to like 10. We don't need it to be that high. And we went to the bake type and changed from combined to diffuse. That's because we want to just bake the base color map or the diffuse map or the albedo map. They're the same thing. Then we remove the contribution of the light. That's the direct and indirect light. And once you're done with that, ensure that you select the texture over here that you're working with. You can also preview the texture that you're working with by coming to this drop down here, and you can check for the new texture that you've created. That's the wood diffuse. Initially, it's going to be black. That's because we do not have the textures, baked yet, but this is just what we want. And also ensure that you select the object. And once you have done all this, that is, select the texture that you want to bake into, ensure that the object is selected. You can now come over to this button and click on bake. And it's just going to take a while, depending on your processing power, and it's going to create a texture for you. Awesome. So we have our baked texture over here, and you can see how it looks. And just so you can put into context what we're about to do, you can see that before connecting this texture over here, you can see that the material output is grayed out. And once we connect this newly baked texture, we can see that it still looks almost exactly the same. So that's the power of baking textures. Now, if we look closely at this preview, I'm currently at the old preview over here. And if we look at the surface, we might not be seeing any sort of roughness attached to it. And let's say we wanted to even work on the strength of how rough this is. So we have some bumps over here, and we can decide to bake the normal as well. We're going to do the same thing. But before you move ahead, please ensure that you save your file. Anytime you see an asterisk sign, you can see that we have this asterisk sign over here, or even on the Blender title here, you can see that there's an asterisk sign. Anytime you see it, it means that you do not have something saved. So in this case, for the image, we're going to save it in our system by clicking on image, then go to save as, and you'll be able to save it in your system. And I'll just save this as the wood diffuse, and I'll leave everything as it is, and I'll change this file format from PNG to JPEG so that the file size will be less. So click on save as image, and now I have that saved and the asterisk is gone. So if you want to check, you can delete this over here, open your file browser, go to this space here, and we can check over here that we have our new diffuse. And once you drag it in and connect this, you have it looking almost exactly the same. So we have the diffuse over here. Let me just collapse this a bit. But you can see that it's smooth and there is no bumps. That's because we're currently previewing the new material node setup. So what we need to do is bake our normal map. Do you want to try it out yourself? Okay, let me wait a bit. All right, so let's try this together. So I'm just going to click on this so that we can preview the bumps that we have on the surface. So this is what we want to get for the normal. So I'm going to do the same thing. So I'll create a new image node. So I'll just come to any empty space and click on Shift A, image texture, and I'll create a new wood normal, and it's at 4K because it remembered the last setting, and I'll click on OK. Then I come over to this UV setup over here, UV editor, and I'll click on this drop down and find my wood normal, and I have this blank black texture. So we're going to do the same thing. Ensure that you have the object selected. Ensure that you also have the normal selected. And once you do so, we're going to go over to this bake option under the render properties panel. Switch the bake type to normal. So this is where we want to go. Remember that our max samples was at 10. You can still reduce it, still fine. I am pro the less samples, the better. So let's see. I'm going to click on bake and start baking that texture. So you see that it's faster and it's baking at a much faster rate than before. Awesome. So if I scroll in closely, you can see that this area here that has our UV setup, it has the bumps over here, while here is smooth and it's understandable. So what we just want to do is we can now plug in this normal directly to the normal if we want, and we can now preview the material. So let's get closer. So we can preview the material output. Now we can always add an additional normal node. So you can just come here, add normal map, and drop it over here. So this allows us to increase the strength ourselves. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve. So you can see that it's adding some extra bumps to it. Yeah, okay, so we've been able to bake these textures, and that's the same idea when you want to work with any texture setup that is done or created procedurally. So you need to bake textures so that you can have just one-stop texture that can be used across multiple platforms. So I can now confidently delete this procedural texture node setup because I know that this is what we'll just need for our project. Yes, and you have to also ensure that you save the texture as well. So I'm just going to save this as wood normal and save it as a JPEG. We're good to go.